Welcome to episode 5 of On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. Our podcast is dedicated to helping Christians target the right priorities in their apostolic and interior lives.
Well, welcome once again to On the Mark. I want to thank everybody for joining us on this episode. And I want to thank, as always, Mark O'Donnell for joining us and providing us with his wisdom and insight. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
I guess I just have to let you know, Mark, for this episode, I'm sitting in a dark room, no heat on, wearing my hair shirt, eating my locusts and wild honey. In service to the topic for today, which is asceticism. And this again, as in the previous episode where we took an excerpt from a book by Romano Guardini, and we looked at a chapter on truthfulness. This episode will be focusing on the chapter on asceticism. And I guess just before we launch into it, Mark, probably best to use the definition that Guardini used in his short chapter on asceticism. He says it's derived from the Greek word askesis, meaning practice and exercise in the proper directing of one's life. He begins the chapter by conceding this may not necessarily be the most interesting topic. It's not a popular one, admitting that when asceticism is discussed, it is usually with scorn or annoyance, and many considering it even unnatural. And I'm wondering if maybe you can offer some thoughts on why such resistance to discussing this virtue.
That's a good question. I mean, words conjure up images, and unfortunately, the word asceticism can conjure up the image of an emaciated monk living in the desert alone, with a skull on his work table to remind him of death. And that's not an image that's very attractive to people. It does not inspire one to want to imitate it. So I think that's what Guardini's referring to when he says the word annoys people. I think a better image of asceticism would be like a marathon runner running the last 5 miles of a marathon, or professional quarterback, John Elway or Tom Brady leading a game-winning drive, at the end of the game, or a military leader leading his troops to victory in a final battle. You get that sense of self-denial, challenge, overcoming obstacles. Because self-denial, it's actually the only way to accomplish anything meaningful in life. And that requires a practice in right living. And that's what asceticism is. You can think of asceticism in different branches. There's business asceticism, best practices, legal asceticism, obeying the laws, athletic asceticism, training, social asceticism, living manners, propriety. And then there's spiritual asceticism, trying to be holy. So all of those practices require some level of self-denial. It's just that the spiritual is not seen, and so we're more reluctant to do it. And it's not really a problem with the practices, because people do self-denial all the time. It's more a problem with faith and believing that God's word is true and that I should obey it, and I should try to build a relationship with God, who is spirit. I don't know if that's a good answer for you, but
that's good. And then an important point he makes early on in the chapter, he discusses mentions that there's a distinction between man and animals in the way they modulate their urges and desires. And he tells us in nature, there's this interior drive, and it expresses itself in an external action. If an animal is satisfied, it stops eating. If it's rested, it gets up and so on. And while he admits it would be foolish to set up the life of an animal as the measure of the life of man, he does offer this major distinction between man's urges and those of animals. So what is that?
Well, I think that's a great part of the chapter, because people make this mistake all the time. And they say, all men are dogs, or whatever comparison they want to make. And the reality is, we couldn't be animals even if we wanted to be. The animal is protected. It acts on instinct. That's why you don't see any fat deer running around. They don't overeat. You don't see 500 squirrels running down your street attacking a bunch of other squirrels, because someone stole their nuts. They don't behave that way. So what happens with us, as Guardini explains well in the chapter, is that our spiritual nature elevates our urges and it frees them from this organic structure. So they're free to roam. And that's why you need asceticism to kind of, okay, well, now all these forces are free. And how do I regulate them or channel them in the right direction so that I can live a productive, joyful, happy life?
Yeah, the big distinction there in separating us from animals, of course, and he mentions this pretty prominently in the chapter, is this idea that we're guided by the spirit. And so, in short, it's the spirit that elevates man above his urges. And Guardini states that asceticism means that a man resolves to live as a man. And so I'm wondering, are these urges that we all have, men have, are they bad? Is there a way to bring these innate urges into proper order?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we just observe the environment, I mean, look at just read the news, the domestic violence, the obesity epidemic, alcohol and drug addiction, the rise of suicide among the young and elderly, the gender confusion, the collapse of the marital structure, the acceptance of bribery by government officials. All these are urges run amok. And I'm surprised people don't see this more clearly and realize, okay, these things have to be reined in and controlled so that they can be productive and helpful for people, as opposed to, just destroying them. I mean, one of my colleagues at work, it wasn't maybe a year or two ago, it was a really tragic incident. I mean, his wife had an affair with somebody, and my colleague, he bought a gun, learned how to use it, and went and confronted the guy who also had a gun, and they had a big gunfight outside of a hotel down near Mansfield, Mass. And he shot the guy, thought he killed him, and then he went back to his car and killed himself. And this is somebody who was just sitting next to me at the office, a week or two before. It wasn't like, this isn't going down to some drug infested area. And so I talked to my boss about it. I said, what's going on? How did this happen? And she said, well, he just didn't have the coping mechanisms in place to be able to deal with this. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of an understatement, but it's true. If we don't live the spiritual asceticism, we don't have the inner strength. And what is that inner strength? Well, how did Jesus endure the passion? All these people screaming at him and beating him up and spitting on him and everything else. Well, he has this inner strength to know, I've got to do this to redeem humanity. Well, that's the strength that you'll get if you live a spiritual asceticism and live the practices associated with that. And that's very valuable.
Yeah, I think when we talk about these urges and so forth, there is a tendency to go to the extreme, like in that anecdote you just shared with us. But I think all of us have this urge to become, and I'm going to use the words of Pope Francis here, couch potatoes. And this was an address that he gave back in April of this year, when he was in Budapest, addressing a group of youths. And he basically was saying, look, I mean, really, in essence, what you were just commenting on, and do the will of God and become the best version of yourself. Otherwise, you'll get in the danger of becoming a couch potato. And we confuse happiness with the sofa. We think all we need to be happy is a comfortable sofa, which makes us feel safe and calm, and it allows us to escape the world of or into the world, I guess, of video games and all this, and it keeps us away, or we think it keeps us away from any kind of pain and fear. What he termed the sofa happiness. And I think, as he described, it's one of the most insidious forms of paralysis that can cause harm to people, young people certainly, but to people generally. And then he went on and he said, look, we should be alive and active and ready to take charge. And I'm saying, quoting now, he says, those who dare win the prize. I mean, and he said, okay, well, how do you win? What do you win? Well, how you win in life is as you do in sports, you aim high and then you train. And there's the asceticism that you're talking about, right? And how you train is first you dialogue with Christ, who's, our best coach. He listens to you, he encourages you, and he believes in you. And, I think that's, as I considered this, and as you just shared that anecdote with us, the urges we all have, they may not be as base and as extreme as what you just described. And so I think we want to, as a very fundamental level, see if we can avoid at least getting off the couch in that condition of couch potato that Pope Francis mentioned. He mentions Guardini now, moving away from Pope Francis. He talks about there's a hierarchy of values in living this virtue. What is he getting at there?
Well, I think there are different levels. There's the material values, how our bodies operate, how the world operates, the material world. There's social values, how we interact with others at home, at work, in society. The intellectual values, how we process and adopt ideas. And then there's spiritual values, how we interact with God. And all of those, we have all those values within us. And the issue is that, and Pope Benedict says this in Salt of the Earth, is that if our relationship with God is not good, then we really can't have a relationship with other people that's good. And at first you're thinking, well, gee, that's kind of extreme, isn't it? But when you reflect on it, you realize, no, that's really true. I mean, if we're cut off from God completely, then we're just going to look at other people as who can help me? What can I get out of this person? What do I need this person to do for me right now? And we've all, met people like that, and we've been that way when we're cut off from God. So, we know that, a bad boss is, it's a nightmare, it's just a freaking nightmare. I remember when I started in real estate, I had a mentor, who wasn't Catholic, Christian. He was a good guy, really experienced and everything. And, I was just asking basic questions and trying to be honest about what I thought clients should do and so forth. And he looked at me and said, either you're, really honest and a good person, or you're an excellent faker. He said, I don't think you're a faker, and I think this is just what the business needs. And I'm thinking to myself, okay. And then he went about trying to get more of a commission out of me than he was due. So I was like, but the point is, we all have to be with people like that, and all these different jobs, these different businesses, organizations, institutions, they need good, committed Catholic men and women working within them. And this is how you change the world, is you change the people who are just immediately around you. You don't change the whole institution of, Allied Signal or Manny Hanny or William Ravis. You just impact the people around you, because the reality is those institutions are not going to be around that long. I mean, if you look at my resume, most of those companies are gone. But the people I still know the people who used to work there, but those companies are gone. So we shouldn't get too obsessed with kind of, well, we just need to get control of the company and somehow we can dictate how everybody behaves and so forth. The better way is just training ourselves in these ascetical practices so that we can be a positive influence on those immediately around us.
That's good. He mentions, as he continues in the chapter, that simply following our urges and desires, undoubtedly that could lead us to some moments of real near-term, short-term pleasure and satisfaction, but ultimately it's a prescription to self-destruction. How does the virtue of asceticism act as, a governor to help regulate or properly order these desires?
Well, I mean, I just think of it as training in good practices, whether those practices, as I said before, are in business, athletics, academics, any other worthwhile venture. You're not going to accomplish anything unless you deny yourself and push yourself. Now, it's different in the spiritual area because faith is required, and the change is a spiritual change. And, I mean, I can just look at, in Opus Dei, we have a certain, plan of life that we live, and we try to live every day. And we have different ascetical practices that we try to practice that are not unique to Opus Dei. They've been in the church for 2,000 years, but they're effective, and they help. And we grow in virtue by practicing them. I mean, I had another example from work where I had a woman call me. She was selling her house in Natick. This is years ago, and her husband had left her, and she was kind of a mess, and she had a really nice house. It'd probably be worth like $1,100,000 today. So I called one of my colleagues and asked her if she would come with me. We both went in and we started working with this woman. We got the listing, we got the house cleaned up. And back then, we didn't have all these electronic forms where you could just instantaneously get things signed off on. So you had to go visit with the client to have them sign paperwork kind of regularly, price changes, things like that. So every time we went to visit with this particular person, she would retell the story of her divorce to us. And it was long and cumbersome. And after a while, it was kind of, oh no, here we go again. So eventually my colleague said, look, I can't deal with this anymore. You go deal with her. You seem to have some rapport, and just get the paperwork signed off. And I was able to do that. And the reason I was able to do that, I think, is because I've been trying to live the spiritual asceticism, which helped me live patience, right? And understanding, which otherwise I wouldn't have had. I just would have been impatient and irritated by the whole thing. So there's a kind of a concrete example where how it's going to help you just in your daily life. I mean, in family life, I think it would help you even more because the intimacy's more intense than it is in work.
Yeah, you mentioned divorce. The final third of the chapter, Guardini, he seems to shift from the esoteric to the more practical, starting with describing the dissolution of friendships due to not living this virtue well. And then he comments on marriages. And he says explicitly, that marriages grow dull and empty. And I'm wondering, in your consideration of things, why do so many marriages grow dull and empty?
Well, I think it's there's not enough of an emphasis on building a spiritual life in and through marriage. I mean, marriage is a fantastic vocation. St. John Henry Newman says it is literally the school of self-denial. And that's true. There's so many opportunities to sacrifice yourself for your spouse and kids and others. But if you don't have the spiritual resources to do that, it can become very, very difficult. And it can become almost impossible to do that. So I think, what I would do is, and this is just based on trying to help about 100 married men become saints, is I would try to pray the rosary with your spouse every day. It's a bonding exercise. If your kids participate, great. And I'd also kind of do some spiritual reading together and discuss, like this book is a great book to discuss with your spouse, because in the book, Ordini, in every chapter at the end of it, he talks about the particular virtue in relationship to marriage. And I think that that's a great thing for spouses to read and to talk about amongst themselves. But ultimately, we're going to have to build a strong spiritual life in order to have a strong relationship with anyone. I just think it's more important in marriage because you can actually grow your relationship very deeply. The more you love God, the more you're going to love your wife and your kids. And also the more you're going to love your in-laws or people that you may not like. You're going to be able to deal with them. You're going to be able to be patient with them. So the spiritual asceticism is a key to strengthening those bonds, and that is what's going to strengthen society and the world, because all vocations come out of families. They don't just grow on trees. They all come out of families. The family is the breeding ground for all of humanity, but also spiritual vocations.
I read this article recently, and I guess it was kind of an admonishment to, faithful Catholics, Catholics trying to live struggling to live their faith well. In a sense, I guess the spirit of the article was, be careful. You're not exempt from what's happening with the dissolution of marriages. I mean, in the divorce. But as the article went on, they interviewed couples, and a couple of them had One was an abandoned father. His name was Rob, and he said, "Look, uh, he said my marriage fell apart because of pride." And quoting from him, he says, "Both of us became guilty of self-righteousness. We both thought it was more important to be right than to be happy, and that's a killer for marriage." So we could, this whole idea of asceticism was not lived there. They then quoted this guy Rick, and he said, if you want to have a good marriage, and he was married to this woman, Val, for 35 years, he said, I think this is an important quote, sometimes you have to be willing to make yourself uncomfortable for love's sake. And that's asceticism. And he's talking about, generosity, the willingness to do those things that, communicate love and respect or attentiveness to their spouse, even when they don't make sense to you. And, that's asceticism, and that's what prevents a marriage from growing ill and empty.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah, I mean, he went further and he said, look, to sum it up, he said, I would rather do something that I didn't like with Val, his wife, than something I did like without her. She's my best friend, and when I learn about the things that are important to her, I learn more about myself. She's opened me up to the worlds I would never have discovered on my own, and I like to think I've done the same for her. And I think,
That's a great quote. Yeah.
yeah, and that's a real deal. This guy, 35 years in the battle, and very, very happy with his marriage. Guardini goes on. He talks about life having many strata. And what does he mean by this? Not necessarily the term strata, but what's he mean in the context of this?
Well, I think he
asceticism?
means that, the four values we were discussing earlier. Um, the material, the social, intellectual, spiritual, and we just need to give priority to the spiritual practices in our lives so that we can manage the other value categories appropriately. Without that spiritual North Star, we just become selfish and we enslaved to our lower drives and urges and end up serving and worshiping them. So it's easy to forget about our spiritual practices under the guise that we need to take care of material things at home. But the most important thing you can give to your family is to be truly present and attentive to them when we're actually together. And if we do this, they will value these moments more than any amount of money or material gifts that we can give them. If we don't do it, you become an ATM, where people just withdraw money or spiritual or emotional support from you and leave you. There's kind of a sad story about a gentleman who attended a conference about 10 years ago on fatherhood and so forth. And he described how he was very successful at his job and made a lot of money and provided lots of things for his family for many years. And then he went on one of these conferences and said, well, I should really dial it back, spend more time with my family. So he got a lesser paying job, but it enabled him to be at home more. And after a while, one of his kids came up to him and said, hey, Dad, we need these different things, and he said, well, I don't have enough money to buy those now. I'm spending more time with you guys. And so the kid left and didn't think much of it. Then about a week later, he came back and said, Dad, I think you should go back and take the job you had before because we need that money. And he realized, he said, it was just too late at that point.
Yeah.
That's, I had become this ATM for my family, and that was it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't have the personal relationship with them. And
Yeah.
so
That's
but that's a tough thing to handle. I mean, what do you do at that point?
Yeah. It's so interesting in this. Guardini, he describes the meaning of life, and I'm going to just quote it. He says, the meaning of life does not consist in enjoying one's own sensations and powers, but in bringing about the fulfillment of the task assigned to us. Man lives truly and fully if he knows his responsibility, if he carries out the task that awaits him, and if he meets the needs of the persons entrusted to him. So I'm asking you if I want to focus on this notion of meeting the needs of people entrusted to us, particularly as it applies to parents. And there exists the possibility, as I see it, that in order to pursue living this virtue of asceticism more fully as a parent, perhaps imprudently, a parent, maybe I'm thinking more specifically a father, may impose on the family unnecessary conditions of sacrifice and renunciation, leading to a challenging life for the whole family, not just a life full of challenges. And so I'm wondering for parents today, what is that balance between living this virtue well while still raising a family in which kids can, compete and become forces for good in general society?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think, if we look at our vocation as baptized Catholics to go into the world and to imbue it with the spirit of the gospel, God's given us certain talents, and I think we want to develop those and live up to those. Um, and St. John Henry Newman says, how do you know how to behave and how to work? And he says, well, live up to the light that you have, and God will give you more light. And that, I think, is precisely the way to go. So the initial is, look, I want to try to do the best I can with what I have, and that may open up more avenues for me to grow even more. So you want to balance this ambition, right, with kind of a professional temperance, because you don't want to close off the space that your spiritual life needs to flourish. I was thinking a lot about this, because we talked about St. Thomas More before, and I think he's an ideal model of this, because here's somebody who, early in his life, he spent several years in a monastery because he thought he might have that vocation. And so he developed the spiritual practices that he needed to have a prayer life and to have a relationship with God. And then he realized that wasn't for me. And so then he got married, and and he began his career, and he did extremely well with that. But he kept these spiritual practices going, right? And so even though he became famous and had this enormous estate, um, uh, and he had a nice family, the marriages that he had were a little bit challenging, both of them, but he did well with them. But most importantly is he was able to witness for the truth, because he kept, for instance, in his life, he didn't drink alcohol. Okay. And he reportedly wore a hair shirt as a penitential practice. All right. But he still, he had a nice property. He ate well. He had a nice family. So there was a balance there. He wasn't giving up everything. He was giving up some things. And that enabled him then to bear witness to the truth and to persevere when everyone else was capitulating, right? And so
That's
I look at
perfect
that,
example. Yeah.
and I'm thinking, well, what if he had decided, well, I don't want to be, the chancellor, for the king. I don't want this big job. I'm just going to go and teach in the local high school. And you think, okay, well, he never would have done what he did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So even though he had the opportunity to get anything he wanted, if he had just signed that oath, he could have doubled his real estate holdings. All of his kids would have been given great jobs. He could have had whatever he wanted to write his own ticket. And yet he doesn't, because he realizes this is not the way, God, because of that interior life that he had developed, that spiritual life he had developed, and the wrongness of what was going on. So I think that is he's a good example. People
Yeah.
don't think that they're anywhere near Thomas More, but you should read this biography. It's called Born for Friendship, and we'll put it in the
show
show
notes.
notes.
Yeah.
Born for Friendship, The Spirit of Sir Thomas More by Bernard Bassett. It's just a basic biography. It's not a puff piece, and it talks about both of his marriages, his vocational discernment process, his ups and downs. And when you read it, you realize, that's not that different from my life. I may not have all the talent he's got, but I got some talent.
That's
And I
great.
think you want to encourage your kids to have that balance and to push the talent as much as they can, so they can impact the world for good.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let's wrap it up here, Mark. Just
Okay.
as with other virtues, in order to live a virtue well, it has to be practiced. what are some practical ways we can live this virtue of asceticism in our everyday, ordinary lives?
I mean, I think you can get a plan of life template from anybody, really. Sorry for that phone interruption. But I would, I would get to mass as often as you can, receive communion. I would read the gospel every day, do some spiritual reading, say the rosary. Then I would just look at all your chores that you're already doing around the house and offer those up for different people in your family, people you work with, so forth.
I'm going to interrupt just for a second because you mentioned the rosary. In that address that Pope Francis had made back in April when he was in Hungary, he mentioned there's a great musician. His name is Franz Liszt, late 19th century Hungarian composer. And he mentioned that what they were restoring his piano, and what they discovered as they were cleaning it up, there were a few beads from his rosary that were found. The rosary had broken and the beads had fallen into the cracks in the piano. And it made the impression to the Pope that before a composition or performance, or just a simple moment of enjoyment at the piano, it was usual for him to pray. He spoke to our Lord and Our Lady and about what he loved, and he brought his art and talents to prayer. And so, when we pray, we won't, we shouldn't be afraid to bring to Jesus everything that's going on in our lives, and everything, our emotions, our fears, our problems, expectations, our memories and hopes. I'm quoting the Pope here as he says it. So it's that when you mentioned the rosary, that brought that anecdote to mind. But
That's great. That's
if you
exactly
look
it.
at this composer is world class, and forgive me for my demonstrating or unveiling my cultural ignorance, but this guy's a big deal, and to this day, and here's a guy prior to performance, who knows, says a full rosary, but at least has his rosary beads and sing a decade or so. But yeah, so I'm sorry. So continue on your prescription here for
No, I mean, I
good
think
practices.
that's pretty much it. That the point is, you need to add in this spiritual practices, but the other ones we're already doing. You just need to give them a spiritual intention, and you need to offer them to God. I mean, you're already cleaning up the garage and taking out the trash and cutting the lawn and cleaning the gutters, and hopefully, cleaning up your room and making sure the bathrooms are clean and all these different things, So that's the beauty of the marital structure, is that you really have that all in place. So what you need to do then is let this irrigation system fill it with grace, fill it with water so that it can then, go out and irrigate the world, and
Yeah,
so
for
that
sure.
spiritual life can grow in others.
Yeah, so let's wrap it up there. So I didn't mention fully in this episode the title of the book that we've been focusing on, and it's Learning the Virtues that lead you to God, Leading the Virtues that Lead You to God by Romano Guardini. And so we'll put that in the show notes as well, in addition to what Mark just referenced as the Thomas More book. And why don't we conclude this by first thanking you, Mark, again for joining us, your time, your insight. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for
Just
having me.
yeah, and then we'll just conclude with a quote from Pope Francis, which he posed to this audience. Each one of us should ask the uncomfortable question, what am I doing for others, for the church, for society? Do I think only about myself, or do I put myself on the line for others without calculating my own interests? Let us reflect on our ability to be generous, our ability to love as Jesus taught us, which is by serving others. So I want to thank everybody for joining us again. We look forward to speaking to you on the next episode of On the Mark.
Thanks for listening to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to be notified every time Peter and Mark release a new episode. And visit us on the web at onthemark.show.